Captain Hook may seem like a fairly two-dimensional villain at first, with his only goal being revenge on Peter Pan for costing him his hand and giving him such an on-the-nose nickname. But there was really a lot more to it, and though it's not mentioned in the original Disney movie, it seems like his need to get revenge really stems from his obsessiveness, a character trait that was described in depth by Serena Valentino in her book about the pirate villain's origin. And it turns out that this same character trait was the main reason that Hook became a pirate in the first place. Captain Hook was depicted by Disney as being driven by a single obsession, capturing Peter Pan and his team of Lost Boys, and it looks like that might have been the result of another obsession of his entirely. In Disney's Peter Pan, they never really mention how Hook ended up in Neverland in the first place, or why exactly he was so obsessed with Peter Pan. But thanks to the 9th installment of Serena Valentino's Disney villain series Never Never, that mystery has been cleared up. All throughout the book, Hook, who was referred to mostly by his former name, James, was shown to have a problem when it came to obsessing over things, no matter what it was. Whenever James sunk his teeth into a subject, he was shown to study it meticulously and eventually become obsessed. And through a series of events that could only be described as a combination of fate and his own obsessions that led him astray, Hook, or James, put all of his efforts into discovering a place that he had set eyes on as a baby, Neverland. It's long been a debate among fans as to how and when Captain Hook first discovered Neverland, but it seems like now there may actually be an answer. It looks like the pirate's obsession with the fantastical world stemmed from his childhood and actually drove him toward the life of piracy that proved so successful for him. You see, Serena's novel Never Never started off literally decades before Disney's story of Peter Pan and his new friend Wendy. It opened up by mentioning a baby named James Bartholomew, the child who grew up and became the villainous Captain Hook. Well, while James and his mother were out in the park, the baby's mom somehow lost sight of his carriage, or pram as it's referred to in the novel, and little did anyone realize that baby James being lost would begin a lifetime of obsession for the child that ultimately led him to the pirate's life. According to Never Never, James fell out of his stroller, and when he woke up, he was somehow in the magical world of Neverland. And it's unclear exactly how much time passed in the real world, but it's stated that James was claimed by his parents from Neverland right before the 7-day mark. Now, this 7-day rule is important because fans of Ever After High will remember that the Lost Boys were actually a group of children who fell out of their prams just like James did, only they were not claimed by humans within 7 days and were therefore cemented in Neverland. In other words, if Hook's mother hadn't found him and claimed him, James might have become one of the first Lost Boys. That wasn't the case though, at least not according to Serena's book, but that does mean Neverland wasn't imprinted in baby James' mind. In fact, it was the opposite. James Bartholomew went on to spend the rest of his life obsessing over the magical Neverland that he saw as a child, and in his attempts to find it again, his obsession eventually turned him into the pirate known as Captain Hook. After baby James got a glimpse of Neverland, it slowly became the only thing that he could think of and resulted in him hating his seemingly pleasant childhood in London. In Serena's Never Never, it's clear that James was unhappy in London and, sadly, he hated almost every aspect of his life, including the idea of becoming a gentleman when he grew up. That being said, he was still depicted as being obsessive over his studies and most other aspects of his life, despite his supposed unhappiness. Though James didn't like going to school, according to Valentino, he was a very good student and he excelled in most of his courses. He even learned Latin at a young age, which is nothing short of impressive, especially since they didn't have Duolingo back then to help him out. Instead, James was able to do well for himself because of his key character trait, his obsessiveness. The same trait would inevitably lead Bartholomew to become one of Disney's most popular pirates that weren't of the Caribbean. It should also be noted that James also loved learning about piracy in Never Never. In fact, he studied pirates extensively and found their lifestyle truly interesting. This could have been why he also taught himself how to read and study various maps, yet another subject that James excelled at and became obsessed with. Only this one specifically, the ability to read and chart maps, would come in handy with where his obsession with Neverland would take him in the future. It was almost implied in Valentino's novel that a big reason James learned to study maps was with the hopes of finding Neverland on one, though that didn't happen. Now, as James aged, he slowly grew into the gentleman that he dreaded ever becoming, and one day his disdain for his own life and his obsession with Neverland finally became too much to bear, so he left and headed toward his life as a swashbuckling pirate. According to the book, Bartholomew left his home in search of a more exciting life that would bring him closer to his goal, which ultimately led him to a pub that he knew was frequented by pirates. And that night, James met and somehow befriended one of the most notorious and deadliest pirates to have ever existed in both real life and fiction, Blackbeard. Blackbeard saw the skills that James had and was intrigued by the young man's desire, so it was at that point in in Never Never that he offered James a position on his ship, and James knew that this position would take him one step closer to fulfilling what he believed was his destiny, but was really just an obsession. And before he was Captain Hook, James was a lowly deckhand on Blackbeard's ship, though he knew that it would eventually lead him to where he needed to be. And honestly, this is where Sabrina's book thrived, with all of the amazing stories of James aboard Blackbeard's ship. It was there that he learned the true meaning of being a pirate. Blackbeard taught James how to be a swashbuckler, and even gave him some very solid advice that, had he taken it, James might not have become the villainous Captain Hook that everyone knows him as. In Valentino's novel, Blackbeard told James realizing one's dream can be a terrifying venture for fear they don't meet one's expectations. And that's really good advice for anyone, but in this case, James could have really taken a lesson from it. If he had just lowered his expectations of Neverland and accepted his life as it was, he might not have become known for the fact that he lost one of his hands. But James continued to obsess over the magical world that he had visited as a child, and despite all of his great adventures with Blackbeard, that was all he could ever think about. And they did have some pretty sweet adventures, one of which included an intense battle with a kraken. None of that stopped James from thinking about Neverland, though, and it was only a matter of time before his obsession drove him mad. James' transgressions with Blackbeard's crew paid off, and he was eventually given the opportunity to head toward the very obsession that drove him to become a pirate in the first place. In Serena Valentino's book, it was clear that Blackbeard was pleased with all of the work that James had done aboard his ship, and the notorious pirate was deeply honored to know him. And that's why Blackbeard allowed James to part ways with his crew, something that wasn't considered normal with pirates. But Blackbeard thought that James had what it took to captain his own ship with his own crew, and that's exactly what Never Never described happening. James turned into Captain James, and he now was in charge of his own squadron of pirates that would follow him to the ends of the earth. Whatever it took for James to finally rediscover the land that he had been obsessing over since he fell out of his pram all those years prior. But now Captain James spent a lot of time putting all of his studies that he learned throughout the book to good use as he tried to find Neverland, though he always came up short. That was until he heard about a group of 3 powerful sisters that helped him out. You see, as James searched for Neverland, he came across the Odd Sisters. Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha were 3 very powerful witches that had had a hand in almost every Disney villain's origin story, according to Valentino. And with Captain Hook, it was no different. The same obsession that led James to become a pirate led him into the den of the Odd Sisters, who, with a bit of magic, were able to help him reach his goal. The book concludes with the idea that Captain James, who still wasn't quite known as Captain Hook, did manage to reach his obsession-driven goal to find Neverland, though it came at a steep price that could be argued included his sanity in the deal. In Never Never, it was implied that now that James had grown up, he was no longer welcome in Neverland. To take things a step further, it even sort of felt like the entire world around him was trying to get him and rooting for him to fail. And as you know, if you're a fan of Peter Pan, it wasn't long before James had another obsession to fuel him and lead him further into the devilish life of piracy, and thus became a never-ending cycle for the pirate that became nothing more than a game of cat and mouse with a young flying boy and his sassy fairy. Do you think that if Hook had remained in Neverland after those 7 days as a baby, he would have been a good lost boy? Or would his obsessiveness have been enough to see him become a villain anyway? Make sure you let us know in the comments below.